Not only is Castlevania Symphony of the Night a masterpiece of video game design, it's teeming with references to history, religion, literature, and folklore. This is the Annotated Symphony of the Night. Hello again, and welcome back to the Long Library. One of the design hallmarks for what we now commonly refer to as a Metroidvania is returning to previous areas after obtaining new ways to explore them. In the Metroid series, this was generally done with the use of new weapons like missiles for red doors and the ice beam to hop up on enemies. The Castlevania franchise, though, uses new abilities for their protagonists as keys to move forward. For this area to be completely mapped, we were required to find two: the double jump by way of the leap stone, which we'll see used very quickly, and the form of mist, which will come in handy in a few minutes. Future videos in this series will see some backtracking to previous areas, which we're going to see a little bit later, but the route that we're taking going forward is meant to limit that as much as possible. This is the corpse weed, which is known as the human faceplant in the very on-the-nose Japanese version. It's a step up from the une that we found the last time we were here. There's actually a slight hit point difference between the base of the plant and the face that it grows at the top. Not that it matters to Alucard and his might. It will drop a potion and an anti-venom. I'm sure you may have been wondering what could possibly be more annoying than the flea man. Lucky for us, the game has an answer in the form of the flea armor. It's exactly what you think it is and drops a high potion and an iron cuirass. This is a neat room. First, these chairs only appear in this one spot in the game, and can be sat upon like other large chairs. Next, the candle on the table drops a stone mask, which is a piece of armor that boosts defense by 2 and intelligence by 4. Its in-game description states that it's an ancient ceremonial stone mask, and further games in the series where it recurs call it a creepy mask used in rituals where the heart of the victim is offered to a dark god. This is all a reference to long-running Japanese manga JoJo's Bizarre Adventure by Hirohiko Araki, where the stone mask would change humans into vampires. In classic creepy castle style, we also have a secret room behind the bookcase if we keep pressing against it. Its rotating effects complemented the PlayStation's polygons. Here we find a topaz circlet that boosts intelligence by +10, and has the bonus effect of healing Alucard whenever he's inflicted with poison damage. We also have the very useful Holy Rod, which is a blunt weapon with a super fast strike speed. There's something of an extra holy blast by using a sonic boom motion. Here's the boss of the area, the Lesser Demon, whom is interesting for a few somewhat inconsequential reasons. First, it has the ability to summon other enemies to aid it. The Mudman that it can conjure, though, is only found here and nowhere else in the game, and must be killed during this fight to find its entry in the Librarian's Bestiary. I'm not spoiling too much by telling you that the lesser demon will be found again later, and will cease to summon these enemies at this point. Also, a user on the cutting room floor found that there was a listing for a greater demon for this fight in the game's files, but no such monster exists in the game. It's possible then that this boss fight was meant to play out with a different enemy sprite that was either never finished or cut at some point. When we find the lesser demon again later, it will have a chance to drop an obsidian sword, which is a great sword with a dashing thrust activated by a sonic boom motion, and a holbein dagger. The latter is called a swift dagger in the Japanese version because of its quick strikes that Alucard can make even while walking. A holbein knife, though, is actually a tool used for painting with its flat, dull tip. It's named after two German painters named appropriately Hans Holbein the Elder and Hans Holbein the Younger, whom lived between the 1400s and the mid-1500s. I call this a clever localization as the attacks from the dagger are an array of colors. Notice the placement of this stopwatch sub-weapon. We're about to pick up another important relic, and this item is actually a clue to our next stop after leaving the library. We'll need to head back through the clock room to get to Orlox's quarters. Lucky for us, though, we already mapped a quicker route. And here we have Alucard's final transformation, the form of bat. As I said in a previous video, the various forms that Alucard can take are references to Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, and changing into a bat has easily remained the most famous due to its appearance in an ocean of vampire films and other various popular culture. With this, we now have the ability to properly map the vast majority of the game and access some out-of-the-way locations. In addition to its obvious gifts of flight, the form of bat can be powered up in a few ways that we'll find down the road, and has a wing smash ability that counts as a magic spell in the spell list. Here we have the first of the many familiars in the game, the fairy. We have a lot to say about these little helpers, actually. First, and perhaps the most widely known, is that there was 7 familiars in the Japanese version of the game, but 2 were cut for international releases, the Sprite and Nose Devil. The Sprite is actually the same as the fairy here, with the added ability to sing to you after finding an additional item. The Nose Devil is the same as the Devil familiar we'll find a little later, but is in fact a joke character. Famous Japanese voice actor and comedian Joji Yanami recorded comedic dialogue for it. The cutting room floor found that all of these, from the familiars to the Sprite's song to Yanami's dialogue, are actually still on the North American Symphony of the Night disc though, and can be accessed via GameShark codes. Familiars also come fairly overpowered. Co-directors Toru Hagihara and Koji Igarashi mentioned in a strategy guide interview translated by Schmapulations that they barely made the cut due to scheduling, and they didn't have time to balance the game around them. This can show in some of the more overt uses, like how our new flying friend can bail us out of most sticky situations, but also in how they can shatter the fabric of the game. We'll see later how some of them can help us hustle the librarian for infinite cash and act as an accomplice to bust out of the castle, all by simply letting their dialogue play out. In fact, most speedruns of the game are based on the fairy's dialogue glitching the librarian to ultimately buy a duplicator in Buffalo Star very early in the game, a combination that does a stupid amount of damage. The fairy's primary use is as a healer. She'll pull items such as food and potions from your inventory when your hit points fall beneath a certain percentage, and will use anti-venoms and uncurses on you if you were to be so afflicted. There are also 2 special consumables that she can only use. The hammer, which will break Alucard of petrification, and a life apple, which instantly restores him to life if his health hits 0. Now that we're heading back into Orlox's quarters, it's time to discuss its namesake and maybe get into why certain pieces of media are considered classics. Certainly there are books, films, television shows, and video games that do things first, innovators and visionaries that take nascent media and define its methods, like Robinson Crusoe or Pong. These are followed down the line by works that can codify a media's vocabulary going forward, like maybe Citizen Kane or Super Mario Bros. We can look back at these artifacts and clearly articulate their place amongst their peers for being dramatic paradigm shifts. Sometimes, such as in the case of The Birth of a Nation, one has to separate appalling subject matter to identify profound technical skill that was years ahead of its time. But there's a gulf thereafter. Certainly further work is innovated and forward thinking, and these have stood the test of time to be considered masterpieces. Others have scaffolded so many great ideas into a larger mosaic that their greatest achievement, for lack of a better way of putting it, is by simply being good. They stand above their contemporaries and continue to enlighten and entertain well after their time in the sun by not doing anything new, but by simply doing what they do better than anyone else. Symphony of the Night's place in history is very much defined by the context around its release, the last hurrah for two-dimensional games that was inspired by previous masterpieces to become something greater than the sum of its parts. A video game that was good at a time when its kin were supposedly fading away. F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu is a similar masterwork. Certainly it was not the first silent film, nor the first horror movie ever to be made, or even the first film to bear Dracula as a character. A 1921 silent Hungarian film titled Dracula's Death, now considered a lost film, holds that honor. It was, however, the first time the Dracula narrative was put to film, though with many of the names changed due to the Stoker estate's hold on the novel's rights at the time. Though not a clearly defined piece of the German expressionist film movement, of which other works of Murnau had been, Nosferatu is a piece of singular horror film vision. Its stark visuals and dramatic use of contrast are only part of why we consider it a work of genius to this day. Like Symphony, it was something of a film out of time, being released in 1922, only a few short years before the jazz singer revolutionized movie sound and the silent era would come to a close. In fact, the Stoker estate sued the film's producers and ordered all prints of the film destroyed, but enough of them had survived that it finally made its way to the United States in 1929, the same year the jazz singer was released. Evidently, significant changes to names and locations weren't enough to keep it from being nearly completely lost forever, thank goodness, including replacing the name of Count Dracula with Count Orlock, for whom this area of the castle is named. Incidentally, the subtitle for the film's German release was Eine Symphonie des Grauens, which roughly translates into a symphony of horror. The jars we open on the way up here contain a mana prism which restores drained magic, a resist fire which of course boosts fire defense, and a luck potion that spikes Alucard's luck stat briefly. Remember way back in the first video when Alucard's dialogue with death replaces no with because they just had it lying around? It comes from this situation where he changes back into his human form in a situation where he can't move. And here he is, Count Orlox himself. Notice how he at least retains the bald head that actor Max Schreck affected in the original film. The librarian notes that he's a magic-wielding vampire that rules the upper part of the castle, which is significant for the series because it's the first time that other vampires are mentioned in the Castlevania universe outside of Dracula and Alucard. He takes multiple forms after his first is killed, much like Dracula 2, and for what it's worth, the first is 666 hit points. Our prize for overcoming Orlox is the Echo of Bat Relic. By itself, it's fairly useless, but has a significant use in a later part of the castle, which we'll see in a video down the road. This is the Sword Familiar, and it's perhaps the most widely used by Symphony players based on its potential damage output alone. In this early stage, it will fly roughly close to an enemy's placement in a room and perform a spinning attack, but will fly in and out of the screen to snipe foes once it hits level 50 and above. At that point, it will also become a weapon that can be equipped like a normal sword. Out of the gate, Alucard and the Sword Familiar can perform a magic spell called Sword Brother that attacks all enemies on screen, which has a much more fascinating secondary use. It glitches the hell out of the game. First, we can perform this in various spaces of the castle and fly outside of the walls, which appears on the in-game map as white squares and not blue. Clever glitch hunting players have found places all over the game that use this for a little extra exploring, but there isn't anything significant to be found on the other side of the castle walls. Another game-destroying use for the Sword Brother spell is how it mangles the game's integer values to duplicate jewels. This means making piles of copies of any of the jewels in the game to make piles of money off of the librarian. To do this, Alucard casts the spell just before speaking to the shopkeeper. If the weapon is spinning, he can access the pause menu, something not normally permitted during conversations with an NPC, and equip a jewel into his accessory slots. As long as it's the last of any particular jewel in his inventory, he can exit the pause menu and still sell this one item, which has the handy effect of creating 255 copies now found in his inventory. As the water in this fountain changes to blood, let's wonder together if this is a reference to the Versailles stage in Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis, or one of the plagues of Egypt from the biblical book of Exodus, when Moses similarly transfigured the Nile. If this room feels like an anticlimactic letdown, it's because it's a byproduct of removing the sprite and nose devil familiars from the game. The North American localization team had to reshuffle where a few of the familiars were found, and this is actually where the Sword Familiar was originally. With that, we'll quickly map the rest of this open space, and then say goodbye to Orlox's quarters and head to our next destination. Last thing about the Sword Familiar is that there's a nice bit of cut content that Igarashi makes a mention of in the Double Fine Devs play video. There was originally going to be an ability or spell called Darkness Edge that would be performed by both the Familiar and Alucard. Dialogue was recorded for it in the Japanese version, and would start by the sword yelling, "Be sliced to pieces," with Alucard following screaming, "And die." The attack would then begin with both saying, "Darkness Edge." It was ultimately cut because they couldn't figure out what the ability actually would be, and the best way to implement it. Here we are back at the clock room, and this is where we'll end this video. Tune in next time as we go underground in the castle and find other secret entrances. Thanks for watching.